Yeah, I think there are several challenges as the industry grows. I think there's definitely when you think, and I think these two go hand in hand, is when you think about products and services and new
Mhm.
solutions that we're creating in financial services, is who gets access to it, right? Because one of the biggest challenges that we face is like challenges around socioeconomics and access to money, which
Right.
is equals power and influence.
Hey friends, welcome to the Techunlocked podcast. I'm so glad you're here. This show aims to demystify tech careers and diversify the tech industry by giving you the keys to unlock your successful tech careers. I'm your host, Grace McJones. Let's jump right in. Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Tech Unlocked podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome. If you've been listening for a long time, thank you for listening. Today, I'm so excited to have Kim Vu on the podcast. She has over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, and she is a champion for diversity and inclusion. And I'm so happy to have this conversation today. So, welcome to the show, Kim.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here, Grace.
Yeah, and so let's just jump right in. How would you describe what you do? Because I feel like you're kind of in the intersect of fintech, financial technology, but also you work in the space of inclusion and diversity. And so, if you had to break it down to someone who's never really heard about fintech, how would you kind of explain it?
Yeah, I would explain it in terms of, it's that intersection between financial services, like the banking services that everybody needs, and the technology behind it. How do we digitize it? How do we make it more accessible and easier for everyone to be able to access it?
Yeah, I love that. That's so simply put. And so, how did you find yourself here, in your current career? And you've been here for a while, about, over 20 years. Was it something that you always thought you would end up in, or was it something that you kind of stumbled into?
Yeah, I think it was a little part, half and half of stumbling into it and then kind of planning accordingly. My biggest inspiration for how I got into fintech was really my dad. My parents are immigrants from Vietnam. They immigrated here right as the Vietnam War was ending. So, as refugees, they came to this country and we're working a number of different types of jobs just to make ends meet. And my dad, while working several different types of odd jobs, also was going to night school at a satellite location for a large university in Texas, and ended up getting his degree in business and computer science. And that experience of seeing what my dad went through and how he went through the process of getting his degree as an adult, right? Like he didn't go to college like the way that we had the opportunity to go to college in our in our late teens and early 20s, but he went as an adult to get his degree. And how we struggled as refugees early on, and seeing what that degree did for my family. um, Not only did it create the opportunity for my dad to have a better opportunity for a middle to high paying job, but it changed the complete trajectory of our family. It gave us the opportunity to be able to move to the Bay Area where he found a job as an engineer, and provided us opportunities, my sister and myself, to be able to have opportunities that my parents didn't have, both from an education perspective, but also just from lived experiences. And so that really informed the way that I thought about education, how I thought about money, how I thought about access to financial services. And so when I was in college, one of my first jobs, like middle of my college years, was I took a job as a teller, a part-time teller, so that I could, pay for my own expenses and things like that while I was going through school, and just learned more about like banking. And as I graduated in early 2000s, right in the middle of the dot-com bust, while everybody was trying to find a job, really similar to kind of what's happening right now with unemployment, lots of very experienced people in in the job search pool. And me, just having just graduated from college and not having a ton of experience, I really had to lean in on like the experiences of my part-time jobs that I had during college, and that had just happened to be in banking.
Wow.
So I really leaned in on those opportunities and found a job to work at a credit union in the Bay Area that focused on the tech sector, and got my foot in the door. And it just opened up a whole world of financial services to me that I didn't actually intend to go into. It just was more out of circumstance because of the current situation at the time when I graduated. And it's now formulated into just an incredible opportunity over the last 20 years of being able to build businesses, really understand the banking environment, the corporate environment, how to build different lines of businesses, build teams, from scratch, and then being able to then transfer that into work that has been really transformational when it comes to social impact in the financial services space. So working in corporate social responsibility, working in corporate philanthropy, having opportunities to really like build out strategy around that, and then moving into other roles within the industry like I am today in diversity and inclusion.
That's so powerful. And just listening to your story, I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes happen from, working as a bank teller to, working at a credit union. And I know you worked for Bank of America as an executive, and now you are the global head of DE&I at Remitly. Like, so much transformation has probably happened in those few years. And so, when people think about, this type of technology with money and dealing with finances. How is the work that you're doing right now at your company shaping the world that we live in?
Yeah, I think what's super exciting about what Remitly is doing and what really gravitated me towards the company is that our mission is to really create financial inclusion and equity in financial services around the world, to make financial services accessible to immigrants who are working all over the world to be able to send money home to their families. So we're trying to make sure that it's accessible, that it's affordable, that it's efficient, and that it brings peace of mind to them so that they know that their families at home have what they need in order to thrive.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know that when we talked earlier on, we share like a common like scenario of going to Western Union because as immigrants, we
Yep.
have parents who have family members back home, and it's like, oh, let's go send this money, and usually they're like in sketchy places, and you're just like,
Yep.
is this safe? Like, Dad, where are we going? um,
Same.
and so now that technology is developing, it's like you can do it all from an app. Like that is
Yep.
mind blowing, I think, to the older generation where it's just like I don't have to go to a physical location. I can use a trusted device or an application and send it to friends and family and to keep that close connection. And so kind of like give us a high level overview of how the app works for Remitly.
Yeah, what I think has been really transformational within the remittances business over the last few years is being able to watch the digitization
Mhm.
of remittances and financial services overall, is that it's created way more access, and it's also made it more affordable. Right? Because traditionally, just like you were sharing about the experience of going to like a location where there's a Western Union or a MoneyGram, similarly, I did the same thing with my parents growing up too. But those brick and mortar locations have a high cost, for overhead and things like that, and those usually those costs get transferred to the customer in terms of fees.
Right.
Um, and so being able to digitize the services also helps create some cost savings that we can then transfer in terms of cost savings to the customer to make it more affordable and easier. But also because the business, for us at least, started out as a digital business. And so it allowed for us to really think about how we create from the beginning a process that's far more accessible and more efficient, and thinking ahead in terms of like the future of money and the future of how
Yeah.
immigrants can access money, especially when it comes to beyond remittances. You think about other financial services that immigrants need as well, right? So our other product that we recently released just over almost a year ago, called Passbook, which is basically a digital account, a digital debit card, which also allows for undocumented workers to be able to access financial services as well, which is a huge barrier
Wow.
for many people to be able to do that. So it's really goes back to, again, that mission of like, how do we create equity and financial inclusion within financial services?
I love that so much. And I love that your story is mission driven. It's not just about, oh, here's my career and what I can do. It's like, no, how am I impacting my community as an immigrant, as a woman, as a person of color? And so I love that you were able to do that through your job. And so, being the global head of DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm sure you've, come up with or have seen a lot of challenges in terms of, you know, the fintech sector and hurdles. And so in terms of like seeing that sector growing, what are some challenges that you see and how do you think they can be overcome?
Yeah, I think there are several challenges as the industry grows. I think there's definitely, when you think, and I think these two go hand in hand, is when you think about products and services and new
Mhm.
solutions that we're creating in financial services, is who gets access to it, right? Because one of the biggest challenges that we face is like challenges around socioeconomics and access to money, which
Right.
is equals power and influence. So
Mhm.
when you think about financial inclusion, that is a really big key piece of it. So you're thinking about those new products that within financial services, who gets access to them, right?
Yeah.
Um, is a really big piece, but also, which is like I think an input to that too, is who gets to design those products, right?
Yeah.
Who has the lived experiences to be able to get to design and develop those products, because I think that's really important. So the customer voice is really important, but also
Mhm.
who is actually designing and develop, like who is the developer behind it, who are the UX and UI designers who have that lived experience similar to you and I, who had to, for in our example, like use remittances. Like, what was that like to be able to now make it easier so that even during times of like a global pandemic where going into a physical location is not accessible,
So
how
true.
do we now still continue to make those financial services accessible, even in moments like this that we're experiencing today? So I think that that's going to continue to be, I think, a really important question to continue to ask ourselves, um, collectively, like as we think about like what's next and what else needs to happen in terms of creating more financial inclusion. The other piece too, which I think is more um, uh, like more broad, is
Mhm.
just thinking about that intersection of security, privacy, and ethics, because there is so much like customer and consumer data within financial services. Who gets access to it? Do customers, especially customers who have historically been left out of systems but their data is accessible, like do
Yeah.
they have control over their own data, right? To
Mm.
be able to say yes or no, XYZ company or government, you can access my data, right? So I think things like that around the use of customer data, the security and privacy behind it, and like those ethical questions that companies, businesses, and societies, right, need to continue to push and ask ourselves to make sure that those protections are in place for consumers and communities at large.
I think those were excellent points. I mean, I'm trying to like just go over everything you said because you said so many good things. And I think a term that stood out to me was financial inclusion, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
money is power, and you want to make sure that people who are designing the systems, like you said, or even designing this technology, represent the people that it's serving, and so it's not just benefiting one group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that there's now that consciousness of like, okay, yeah, like we need to make sure that our workforce is diverse, our designers, our programmers are diverse, not just because it's good to have, but it's because of the awareness of the amount of impact and influence
Yep.
that technology has, around the world and, in other people's lives. So I'm glad that the financial sector has this realization, and is acting upon it and making sure that we're building with inclusion in mind. So that's excellent to hear. And so, with moving on to like your actual like day job and your
Yeah.
position, and you being a champion for diversity and inclusion within your workspace and even in just the financial community in general, what are some tips for leaders to continue to make their companies more inclusive now that we live in a virtual environment? Things are changing. Work has already changed for a lot of people who are working remotely. And so how can they continue to foster an inclusive environment in a virtual space?
Yeah, I think one of the more like important things to recognize too right now, especially for companies that didn't start out during this time as a virtual remote company,
Mm,
is that we're still in a pandemic.
so
So
true.
this is not a normal work from home
Yeah.
remote like experience, right? And
Yep.
so just making sure that we're keeping that top of mind, that a lot of people are like, lots of stuff is operating in the background for all of our employees. So as leaders, whether you're like a people manager or not, like we're all leaders, and in that regard, like of like thinking about like what's my role within the organization to support my peers and my teammates across the company, in terms of thinking about like what is operating in the background, and am I checking in with my teammates and my employees, specifically around like beyond the like performance, how are you doing at work, like are you getting
Yeah.
your projects done, but really like that well-being, like regular well-being, like emotional well-being one-on-ones, and checking in
Mhm.
on everybody to make sure that they're okay, right? And everybody's situation is totally unique right now, right? And so just making sure that in order to be inclusive, that you are acknowledging that there are a lot of unique experiences for each person that is happening in their home and in their lives right now, and how do we make sure that we can accommodate and support everybody through that process. The second thing I would say is, during remote work, that I think gets forgotten, is that like in spite of all that, right, like we still want to develop and we still want to grow,
Yeah.
right? Like don't forget to continue to invest in like development conversations, right? Like making sure that we're continuing to make the time to mentor and to sponsor, and to talk about career development and career growth, because there are still opportunities. While I know there are, many companies that are, downsizing, there's also many companies that are continuing to
Hiring.
grow,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and hiring. And so like I think it's really important to keep that in mind as well, is that people still want to grow, they still want to learn, they still want to develop, and companies should continue to do that, especially for their teammates from underrepresented groups.
Love that. I think those are practical things that, like you said, you don't have to be a people manager or leader to do it. I think individually we can all take those steps and put it into practice. And so, with that being said, with everything going on with COVID, we've had a lot of protests and things going on with social justice and racial justice. And there's a lot of talk about like allyship, right? And people are like, oh, I'm an ally, I want to advocate for other people. But from your perspective, what are some, practical examples of what authentic allyship looks like? Because I know there are different types of allyship. There's convenient allyship, there's lazy allyship.
Yeah.
And so from someone who has a ton of experience, and you work in this space and you work with several ERG groups, employee resource groups, what are practical examples that, people who are listening right now can take to be an authentic ally?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things around that I think is critically important right now, but always important
Mhm.
ongoing, regardless of what situation that we're in, is recognizing your privilege and power,
Yeah.
and really leveraging that to call out bias at any time, right? So not just right now, but ever. Like if you want to be like an anti-racist active ally, like these are the things that you need to be doing, is understanding your own privilege and how you can activate that to um, advocate for changes in process and policy, because
Mhm.
that's where all the systemic issues are, right? Where we see all
Right.
the systemic inequities within organizations, within communities, comes from the fact that there are like deep-seated, inequities that exist within the processes and the policies that dictate our companies and dictate our communities. And so
Yep.
those things need to change. And so how we go about that in terms of really taking it apart and thinking about like, what does it look like for us to either reinvent it,
Hmm.
reimagine it, or completely take it apart and do something completely different? We need to be asking ourselves those questions right now, and moving towards change in that way. And then the third thing I think that everybody can do within organizations is active sponsorship and mentorship, and really opening up your networks and opening up doors and sharing that tightly held knowledge that so many of us have not had access to because we
Yeah.
didn't come from the same networks or we didn't come from those same backgrounds. But for those who have that access and that privilege, to start to really rethink like, how do you think about like how you leverage your influence and how you provide access to that information and that knowledge?
Yeah, I think you're so spot on. I think something that one of my mentor always says, it's like, if you're someone with privilege, lend that privilege. That's like the easiest thing that you can do. So if
Yep.
you're someone who's like mentoring someone and you're in a position of power, and you have someone who has, maybe a product or something they have to share, like just leverage
Yep.
your audience or whatever you have and share that with your audience. It sounds so simple, but it makes like a world of difference.
Yeah.
And then I think you also are aware of like, okay, wow, like I think that was simple, but I can see the impact that that's having on somebody else, and that can go like a long way. And so those are extremely practical things that we all can do. And so
Yeah.
lastly, for those who are listening and probably figuring out, okay, how do I get into tech? And maybe they're wondering, maybe in the financial sector, because I feel like this is something that's really passive in a sense. Like I think
Uh-huh.
everything else is like cool, like AI, robotics, like that's all you hear about. But I do feel like people who have, like sort of like a passion and purpose for this are probably like, okay, like I have this passion, I have this purpose. I didn't even know maybe this kind of sector exists. What are 3 tips you would give them in terms of like entering into technology and maybe even just financial sector in a sense?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have 3 tips that I can share around that piece of it in terms of that transition into tech. But also, I think what's important to like call out as well is that like, just because you're going into tech doesn't mean you have to be technical, right? Like
Yes,
there's so
thank
many
you.
different jobs within tech that
Yes,
do not require you to know how to code, right?
spot on. Yeah.
And so like I don't know how to do that. I've only taken one coding class, as an HTML class right after like high school or after
Yeah.
college. And the only thing that it's ever helped me do is like make my MySpace page really pretty, and MySpace
Yes,
isn't even
my
around anymore. Right?
yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's so many different jobs within tech that exist that are non-technical, right? But
Mhm.
equally important to like be present in those spaces. Like we need to be there. Like as well. And so like, yes, like a lot of jobs in tech are technical, and yes, there's lots of need for folks to show up with those technical skills, especially from underrepresented groups. Going back to my comment earlier about like, we need people who can design and develop, that are, that represent diverse lived experiences in the product itself. But also, there's so many non-technical jobs that also exist within the tech sector
Mhm.
where you can still add a ton of value, and still really be able to like enjoy your work in the same way. And so, like in those transitions, I think the 3 things that you should be thinking about is, the first of which is like, know what your personal values are and go through the exercise of really understanding that. Like, And that will help you really see when you come across companies or managers or teams to say, like, do those values align with mine? Because if you don't walk in without, when you walk into an organization not being really clear on what that is, you can easily then, you know, things can go in directions that you don't expect, and that's not what we want, right? So like making sure that you're really clear on that, because that will really help you decide, like, this is a great opportunity for me because it's a lot in alignment, or is this just an opportunity for right now? Which sometimes in some cases that might be what you need in the short term, but I think, you know, if you're really thinking about that long-term investment in your career, like make sure there's values alignment. The second thing that I think is really important is when you're thinking about those transitions and thinking about your career long term, is don't just think about what your next job is going to be or your next role. Think about what your next job is going to be. And
Wow.
what I mean by that is really thinking like, what's like that next job that I really aspire to, because that will inform as you work backwards where the gaps are, and then that can help you inform what your next job needs to be, right? So then you can be far more strategic in terms of being like, okay, like I know my next job is going to be this job, but I don't have the skills for that yet. So what job do I need right now that's going to get me there, right? Versus I just aspire to that next job, and then like you're just kind of floating through, and or like allowing happenstance to happen to
Yeah.
you to get you to where you want to go, which is great. That works too for a lot of folks. But I think, you know, especially for people of color, for women, for those of us who, you know, are from underrepresented groups, we have to be more strategic about our opportunities, because they're so hard to come by, right? So it does really require some like strategic thinking in terms of like thinking about like what's that next. And then the third thing I would say is that you're not in this alone. Like, tap the community. We have such an incredible like community, especially like our community of women of color, especially in the Northwest. Like,
Yeah.
you know, tap into that community. Like, we all understand like where you're at and what's going on and how hard it is. Like, let us help you. Tell us what you need. Like, we are here. Like, you know, like, and we want to be able to support you. Like, and I think like the whole idea of mentorship and sponsorship doesn't just happen like inside your organization. It happens outside the organization too, through our own networks, right, that we've built over time. And so I think it is really valuable to be able to recognize that like there is a community around you that wants you to succeed.
Wow. Like, I'm like, I need to take notes because these are all gems, but I'll listen. I'll listen back. But that is just so, incredible. I think all three points that you mentioned, I think that highlighting obviously that there are non-technical roles within the tech industry. And I think that sometimes people are reluctant because they're like, oh, well, I don't know how to code, or I can't do this thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, that shouldn't be what stops you. And I know there is that
Yeah.
narrative and we need engineers. I'm one of them. And it's just like, but there's more space beyond that. And we need people of color and people who are willing to share their ideas and their experiences in those non-technical plays as such. And also it has equal impact because it's helping us develop all the technologies and the products that we're working on. And I think you just mentioning, whenever you're thinking about your move, think 2 steps ahead, right? Because I do feel like, especially, I think younger people are early in career films, it's just like, okay, what's like next? And we never really think ahead to that next step. We may think, okay, one day I want to become like a VP, but that's one day, it's not
Right.
really something really practical. But just looking 2 steps ahead, I think that's a really good advice, and so that you're not just randomly thinking like whatever opportunity you get to it. And I think the third thing that you mentioned, I think that being able to I lost the third thing already.
Tapping into your community.
Tap into your community, yes. And I was like, that's so cool because that's how we kind of met through
Yeah.
women of color community. And I remember I was like, oh yeah, like we connected after an event on LinkedIn. I was like, oh yeah, let's like meet up in person. And it's a COVID right now, but I'm like, I just remember reaching out and I knew that you were someone who loved helping other people outside like maybe your day job and you were for the
Mhm.
community. And I think that's so key because people think like, oh, I have to do this alone, like no one will help me.
Yeah.
And that's why this podcast exists, I think, to be a resource and to also share, voices of others who are a resource and who want to share their experiences with other people. So if you're
Mhm.
listening and you've been thinking about, being in tech, make sure you take all those notes down because I think those are very, very vital and, practical applications and tips that you can use when considering moving into the tech industry. And so to switch things a little, we're going to go to a
Uh-huh.
lightning round.
Okay.
And no pressure. They're like simple, easier questions.
Okay.
Uh,
I'm ready.
you ready? Okay, cool. First question, what is the number one misconception about your job?
Oh, that DEI only serves as an HR people only function or purpose.
I
And it's so much more than that.
Yeah, I think it's just a narrative, but it's definitely so much more than that, for
Yeah.
sure. What is your favorite piece of technology right now?
Oh gosh, so does kitchen tech count? 'Cause
It's tech, it's tech. It's not
I guess because I
I don't even know
really
that's a
enjoy
real thing.
cooking.
Kitchen tech, yeah, blender is technology.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
sure,
actually,
yeah.
yeah, that's what I was gonna share. I'm like, I got this really new high-powered, like
Okay,
uber quiet blender
nice. What brand is
with
it?
yeah, it's Wolf. Yeah,
Okay.
it's great. Yeah, it's so awesome. So helps speed up the smoothie making process.
I've never heard about like a silent like blender, so I definitely have to check it out.
Right? There
Yeah,
you go.
that's super cool. How would your parents, describe what you do, like in terms of like your job?
I think they would say that I make work environments fair for everyone. And
Okay,
that would be like the extent of it.
gotcha. They're like, oh, she does something with people. Yeah, in tech. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. What is something that brings you joy right now?
We're talking about tech, but the thing that brings me joy right now is actually unplugging from it. Yeah, like
Yes,
the importance because we spend so much time, like right
100%.
now on Zoom and on all the things, right? There's like dings and bings and bells and whistles and all the things that are happening all day long. And so the ability to unplug and just like reconnect to like the natural surroundings around us here in the Northwest has been really kind of just helped me stay grounded through all of this because as we all know, there's a lot going on right now, right? And so
Yeah. Hmm.
being able to find some small solace in like our natural surroundings has really brought me joy.
Yeah. It's so necessary to unplug, especially during
Hmm.
times like this.
Yeah,
It's time for your, mental health and self-care. So that's great.
totally.
Um, what is the best advice you've ever received?
Mm,
Career advice.
understand. Yes, best career advice. Understanding where the money flows through an organization.
Hmm. Okay, that's way different from anything I've heard. I love
Yeah.
that. And then last question, where can people connect with you online?
Yeah, on Twitter
Okay.
at Kimmylyn, Kimmilyn, or on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for joining me on this conversation. I know that I learned a lot. And like I said, I'm going to go back, take some notes because a lot of the things you said are so important. And I think that, having a diversity of even just topics, for this show, I'm like, I want to learn too. So I'm going to be I
Yeah.
can learn from and hopefully other people can learn from. So this has been fun, chatting with you and just learning about your personal journey, your career journey, and your story. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the invite, and I'm so excited to be able to contribute. Thanks a lot, Grace.